how much can I make as a medical biller? This is a question that I get all of the time. And I decided that today is going to be the day that I let you know. How much can you make as a medical biller? Or at least how much have I made as a medical biller? Because I can only tell you this from my experience. I can't tell you what other medical billers make, but I can tell you what I made. And so I'm going to talk to you today about how much you can possibly make as a medical biller and if it is worth switching to, or if it is worth, expanding and staying in for the long run. My name is Tamika. I'm a certified professional biller and a certified professional practice manager, and I am now fully self-employed. So if you haven't heard my story before, I've been a biller since 2006 as an employee, and I will link that video above. It is a part of my membership here on YouTube. So if you haven't joined that membership already, please do, because you don't want to miss those stories. Those stories are things that you really should know about, because sometimes you just need the nitty gritty of what's happening and you need the tea. And those are in my membership videos. I also do, or I will be doing, lives monthly in my membership. So just throwing that out there. So today's video, I'm gonna break it out into sections, because being a medical biller can be done in different ways. And I have 3 ways that you can be a medical biller and how much you can make within those 3 ways. Why? Because I've done all of them. I have been a medical biller for 20 years now, 20 years this year, and I have done it all. So let's jump into it. Now, I started off as an employee, as a medical biller. That's how I started in this whole arena of things. And I was an employee in an ophthalmologist's office. So it was an office that did surgical procedures. We had visits. We had 2 doctors who worked full-time. I'm telling you all of this because all of this matters when it comes to how much you can make and all of that stuff. But we'll talk about that later. So as an employee is the first way that you can make money as a medical biller. Now, in my first job as an employee, I made 6% of the revenue that the providers brought in. So it was based on percentage. And with that, I made about a range. Because it's a percentage, there's a range. You won't get the same amount each time, because the provider will not bring in the same amount of money each time. So this month or this bi-weekly paycheck, I would get, maybe $2,500. And then the next paycheck, I may get $3,500. And then the following paycheck, I may get $4,000. So in that first job as an employee, I was being paid percentage. Now, as far as I know, percentage as an employee is not, I wouldn't say it's not common, but I don't think many employers do that. Correct me if I'm wrong, put that in the comments, but I don't think many employees do that. I was fortunate, I believe, enough for my employer to pay me a percentage. And I think that's because back then that was the mindset of billers, like you paid them a percentage. And 6% at that time was the percentage that you paid, at least within my community. So I was getting paid 6% as a medical biller. I also was doing other duties. And so to be perfectly honest with you, I was making more than 6% in this particular job, because I was also the office manager and I was also the bookkeeper. I came into the job as a bookkeeper. Then I moved to an office manager, and then I moved to a medical biller. And so I wasn't only making that 6%, I was making more, because I also had other positions in the practice. But as far as being a medical biller, I was making 6% of the revenue that the 2 providers brought in. And I was young, I was in my 20s, and that was some very good money. So the second time that I worked as an employee for a doctor's office as a medical biller, I was not being paid percentage. I was being paid hourly, an hourly wage. And I think the hourly wage started off at $25 an hour, which I felt was a good hourly wage. And I worked for 40 hours a week. And so I think with that, I brought in a good amount of money, but it wasn't as good as the 6%. However, I think the $25 is what is more of the norm, especially even now. If you ask many medical billers now what they're making, how much they make, and they are employees, they are making probably around, 20 or even 15 to $25, $30 an hour. If maybe they've been there long, they have seniority, they have more skills, or whatever it is. They are probably getting around that range. And so I was making $25 an hour. I didn't think that was bad. And I had to work 40 hours in order to get the amount of money that I was going to get. So between percentage and hourly wage, that was how I was making money as an employee. Both ways, like I said, was not bad. I was able to pay my bills, I was able to save, go on vacation, do all that other stuff. But, you know, there was a cap. When I got a raise in the job that I was working hourly, I didn't get a $10 raise. I didn't get a $20 raise. I got, you know, cents, maybe $1, but it wasn't that much. I also want to throw in there too that on the second job, I also then became the office manager and the bookkeeper. You're probably going to see a pattern when it comes to that because for some reason, those two other jobs came with my job as a biller. And so with being in that second job, I started off making $25 an hour, but I ended up at the end when I was laid off. If you know that story, I will link that story also. But I was laid off, and at the end, I was making $42.99 an hour. So from $25 to $42.99. And that was not because of just seniority. I was working at that job for, I think it's about 15 years. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's 15 years I was working at that job, and that's what I was ending up with. Now, that wasn't just me doing billing. Again, I was the office manager, I was a bookkeeper, and so when I became the bookkeeper first, my boss gave me a little increase, and it wasn't like $1, it was probably like, $5 or $6, because I let him know I'm doing 2 jobs now at this point. So yes, you might be saving money by not hiring another person, but you also need to incentivize me to do these 2 jobs because those are 2 separate jobs. It is so important for you to know what your job should be and the title that you're holding, what you should be doing, what your duties and tasks should be. It is easy for practices or providers to give you duties that are outside of the scope of medical billing and kind of make you believe that that's what's supposed to be in there. I knew at this point when I was hired that this is my duty as a medical biller, this will be my duty as a bookkeeper, and yes, I know you're saving, but I still need to be incentivized. So I got a raise, like I said, it wasn't $1, but it was a good raise so that I can do both jobs. And then he added on office manager. And so then I was like, okay, so I really need to get a bigger raise because now I'm doing 3 jobs and, we need to figure that out. So I wanted to say all of that to say that sometimes in a small private practice, you are going to have to do other jobs. And I don't want to say going to have to because you have the decision to decide whether or not you want to do it. But for me, I always like to take opportunities. And I'm glad that I took those opportunities because I wasn't only limited to billing. I learned about, being an office manager, what that entailed, hiring, all of those things, HR, blah, blah, blah. And then I also learned about bookkeeping again, because this is the second time I was doing all of these things. So I don't regret it, but I also needed to know my worth, and I also needed to know what these duties are for each of the positions. Just because it's Tamika doing it doesn't mean that it's just one job and I should be paid one thing. So keep that in mind. If you are an employee and you are doing billing, you need to evaluate your duties. Understand what is the duty of a biller, maybe what is a duty of a office manager, the duty of the front desk, whatever it is, and be able to determine whether or not you are doing more than one thing and if your pay is showing or compensating you for that. So the first way to become a medical biller and how much you can make, which I told you, is as an employee. The second way is as let's say a side, and I don't like the word side hustle, but let's say a side or part-time job or a 1099 contractor, however you want to say it. Although being a 1099 contractor, you're technically a business, but sometimes you don't look at it like that, but it technically is. But when I was doing it, I kind of felt it was a side job, a part-time job. It wasn't my main thing for my main income. And in this second part-time job, I was making several different things depending on the provider, I guess I would say. So I'm just gonna go through some of the amounts that I made because each provider paid me kind of differently. It wasn't one thing for all of them. So one of the providers that I billed for on this side, they paid me $20 an hour. And $20 an hour was for me to do the billing from claim submission to patient statements. And I probably worked about, a month. I only probably did about 15 to 20 hours. So I didn't do a lot. It wasn't like a whole lot. I worked on Wednesdays and Saturdays, if I'm not mistaken. And then he paid me once monthly. It wasn't like a bi-weekly thing, but it was $20 an hour to do that. One of the other providers that I worked for, they decided to pay me 10%. And it was 10% of the total revenue that they brought in. They were a provider that did surgical procedures, but they didn't have a physical office. So they did those procedures in the office. Sorry, not the office. They did those procedures in the hospital, and so I billed for them through that. And because it was procedures that they were doing, I did make some good money too, because if they did, 3-4 surgeries in a day, each surgery is, I don't know, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, and then they did that each day, then I got 10% of that. So that was good money. They were kind of, in the phase of retirement, so they didn't do a whole lot, and that's why they didn't have an office, but they did enough where I can get some money. I also had a provider that paid me to do their billing, but it was on a claims basis. Basically, if I billed a certain amount of claims out, let's say 100 claims out or 200 claims out, it depends on how much I sent out, and then they would pay me a flat rate. So let's say between 0 and 100, they paid me $200. Between 101 and 200, they paid me $300. Something like that. I don't know the actual numbers, but it was something to that effect. So I did get like a set amount, but I didn't know how much it was going to be each month because it was dependent upon how much claims I sent out. Hope that made sense, but that's how that worked. After that, I also billed for a provider that paid me it was between a monthly minimum, or a percentage. So how I did that one, because after learning all of these things, you start to notice, well, I do want to make a certain amount of money. So I need to decide what that minimum is. But I also want to make sure that if I can make more money than that, I would like to be able to do that. So this provider, I decided to charge them a minimum or a percentage, whichever one was higher. So if, let's say my minimum at the time, I think it was $400. Now, my minimum is not that now, so please understand that. But as you start to do more billing, you start to understand it, what you're doing, things change. But I think my minimum was like $400 at the time. And they were, again, a small office that didn't see much patients. And they also were not surgical. That's key to understand. But it was $400 as a minimum, and then it would have been 7% of the total revenue, whichever was higher. So if this month the 7% came out to $350, then they would pay me $400 because that's my minimum. But if next month the 7% came up to $600, then they would pay me $600. So I hope that makes sense. And I felt like that was a better thing to do, at least for me. And it was also good for them as far as knowing, well, I have a minimum that I have to pay, so I can budget for that. But if for some reason I make, more money, then this is what it would be. It would be 7%. So that was some different ways that I actually was paid, or how much I was able to make on my side part-time job. Now, for me at this time, I worked a lot. So I was working my full-time job, 40 hours a week. And then I had this side job as a biller. And so I was working basically around the clock. I worked on the weekends because that's when I can get most things done. I worked before work. I have a video about that too. I will link that above. I work before work, I worked during lunch, and I worked after work. And so I just worked a lot. Now, mind you, I love to do billing. So that's not the problem. But you do need to have some type of balance. And I did it for a while. I mean, I did this for a pretty long time, but after a while, you can get burnt out, especially if you have kids. I mean, even if you don't have kids, you have family, you have a spouse, you also want to be able to have a personal life outside of just working all the time. And so that was eventually what my goal was. I didn't just want to be working all the time. But this was also good for me because I was making money on my full-time job, which was pretty good. And so that basically paid my main bills, my mortgage, my utilities, gas, all of that stuff. And then the money that I made as a part-time biller, I used that for like vacations, for splurging, for clothes, for lipstick, for heels, for perfume. Like, I love all of those things. I don't know about you, but I do. And so it was really good. It also, and I want to make this a key point, is that it also helped me save. So I was able to save, have an emergency fund. I was able to have a short-term emergency fund and a long-term emergency fund. And actually, this is what has helped me presently, because I was able to save money for when times come like this one where I may or may not need to use it, but I have some money there. So this was kind of like that middle time when I was, in between working a full-time job and having a medical part-time jobs. And so that was good. But I also want to throw in there that I kind of still had the mindset of an employee. And so at this time, I needed to kind of shift it. It took me a while to start to think differently because, again, my full-time job was taking care of everything. Like, it was kind of like, well, I could take or leave the fact that I got a doctor, or if I had 2 or 3 doctors, like I could take it or leave it. I also only could have a few doctors. So probably, I don't know, maybe probably 2 or 3 doctors is what I had at the time. Of course, they switched out, they changed, all that stuff. But I was really cautious in deciding who I was going to take on because I knew that I could only work a certain amount of hours and that I had a full-time job. So the second way you can make money as a medical biller is by having like a part-time 1099 medical billing thing going on. And the third way is being a medical billing business owner or being self-employed or fully self-employed like I am presently. So this is going to be the first year that I'm actually going to be a full-time self-employed medical biller for the length of the year. And I'm projecting that I'm going to be able to make at least $60,000. Now this is at least, like I said, because I'm definitely shooting for more, but at least I'm projecting to make currently $60,000. You might say, oh, that's it, $60,000. I don't even, that's not any money. Like, I need to make more than $60,000. And you might be right. I want to make more than $60,000. But for me right now, this is a good thing. And it's a good thing for me for several reasons. First of all, I don't work 40 hours a week. I currently work 20 hours a week in my medical billing business. And I'm still projecting to make $60,000. So that for me is a win because I used to make, between $60,000, let's say, to $80,000, but I had to work hours and hours of work. I was working full time, and I had a side job, or I was working as an employee, working 40 hours a week, and but I still had like 3 different duties of jobs that I had to do. So for me to be able to make $60,000, be a medical biller, that's what I do. That I know how to do practice management. I know how to do bookkeeping. And actually one of my clients now is kind of like a bookkeeping client. I only do the AR for that client, but the majority of my clients are providers and I plan to bring on more providers, but I can stick with what I want to stick with, what I want to do. The thing about being a business owner is that you can choose what you want to do. Now, don't get me wrong. I love to do bookkeeping and I loved being a practice manager. And so it still comes out in me. Like, I still give advice. I still help people with their workflows. All of that still matters to me. But my main job, who I am, what I feel like my career is a medical biller. And that is the basics of my business. I also do consulting, I also do credentialing, and that ties to billing. And again, I can do other things. I can do bookkeeping, but medical billing is what I want to do. And with doing or being a medical biller, I think working 20 hours a week and making $60,000 is good. It also helps me to be able to do other things that's outside of that. So I am not a caregiver, but I help take care of my mom. I mean, she could take care of herself, but she got appointments, she got to do all these other things. I have to be running in and out. And if I had a full-time job at this time, that would not be possible. Or I probably would run myself ragged and crazy. And I also probably would not be doing the best job at work because I'm, not focused and I can't be focused on that. But being a business owner, I can be able to rearrange my schedule when we got appointments or when things are going on. And so it's better for me, especially at this time in my life, to be a business owner. But I'm still able to make enough money to take care of myself working less hours as well. So I think that is a win-win. I also have another small business. I don't know if I've ever spoken about it here, but I do personalized pin-ons that I do for funerals, for campaigns, for businesses, and that business is kind of seasonal. I do it all the time, but it gets more amped up and stuff during certain election periods, which this year is an election year, so it's gonna get a little crazy soon. But I'm able to do that because now I'm only working 20 hours a week, making the money that I need to make that way, and then I also can do this other small business and not drive myself crazy. The point of this whole thing is to not drive myself crazy. I'm getting up there in age and I can't run around and maneuver and do all the things that I would do as a 20-year-old or something like I used to before. And I also wanted to mention that being a medical billing business owner, you are able to charge higher fees. So the only way that I could make this amount of money is to be able to charge higher fees. And I don't have a lot of clients, you already know. In my second example of being like a 1099 contractor, I told you I was charging $300 or I think it was $400 for the month. I do not charge $400 for the month because if I charge $400 for the month with the 3 providers that I have, that's going to be $1,200. $1,200 a month doesn't even cover my mortgage. So I could not charge that type of money. But when you're a billing business owner, you have to factor in, many different things that will help you determine how much you should charge. If you don't know about charging, I did do a video or 2 about it. I'll link that above. But you have to charge differently. And so even with only 3 clients or 3 medical billing business clients, I am able to make at least $60,000 this year. Again, I'm shooting for way more than that, but this is the minimum that I'm trying to make. Now, as a disclaimer, I wanted to talk about 4 things that will determine kind of in a way if you can make this type of money, if you can make more money. Like there are certain factors that come into play depending on these 4 things that I'm going to explain. And the first one is the specialty of the provider. There are many specialties, right? You can bill for many, many specialties. Ophthalmology, OBGYN, pediatrics, surgical or general surgery, pain medicine, mental health, physical therapy, chiropractic. I can go on and on and on. There are a lot of specialties out there. But the one thing to keep in mind is, well, first that some specialties do surgeries, other specialties don't. So if a specialty like OBGYN is one that you bill for, and let's say you have 3 providers that are OBGYN providers and they pay you 6 to 8%, you can be bringing in some pretty good money because they are doing surgeries. They are bringing in, $50, $100, $200,000 a month. And if you're getting 6 to 8% of that, then you're bringing in pretty good money also. So you need to keep in mind the specialty that you are billing for. Now, also keep in mind that the specialty that you're billing for, let's say OBGYN, it has a lot more nuances. It may be a little bit more complex. It all depends because I was billing for OBGYN and I didn't really find it to be too complex, but I have spoken to other billers who I don't want to deal with OBGYN. I can't deal with that. It's kind of like a personal thing, it's subjective to the person, but long story short is depending on the specialty that you are choosing to bill for, it can determine how much money you can make. If you are billing for a mental health specialist and they only have 5 clients a day and their reimbursement rates are $120, $150, there's no way that you can make a whole lot of money just with, let's say, 1 client or even 3 clients because they're not bringing in enough money. They are not going to pay you all or half of what they're making if they're not even making that much. So keep that in mind. And the second thing is location. So depending where you are in this world would also determine how much you can make or how much you can get paid, right? So if you live in California versus Florida, or you live in New York City versus Oklahoma City, you may get paid differently as a medical biller because of your location. So if you're an employee and you work in Oklahoma, you may get paid $17 an hour to be a medical biller. But if you're living in New York and you become a medical biller, you may get paid $30 an hour because the cost of living is different. And this also determines or factors in when you are working somewhere and they're determining your salary, right? So as an employee, that would affect you that way. also as a business owner, that would also affect you, because if I am in New York and I am billing for a provider, he may be willing to give me 10% of his revenue because, again, of the cost of living. And so it doesn't always necessarily matter, let's say, where you are, only if you're like an employee and you are working in your physical location, but also where the provider is. Because if, again, I'm in the US Virgin Islands, but I'm working for a provider in New York City, he would, or he or she would probably give me a higher rate, 10%, because they're accustomed to that. That doesn't seem high to them. They are used to paying billers or billing business companies $5,000, $6,000 a month. That doesn't matter to them. So you have to really keep those things in mind as well, because all of this will factor in when it comes to determining how much you can make. So I would even say, for me, let's say I decide I'm going to bill for providers in New York City because they'll pay me higher, but me living in the Virgin Islands, let's say, my cost of living is a little bit lower than that. So it's really becomes really good money for me because they're paying me good, but I'm living here. So this is important to keep in mind. Also, when it comes to duties. So as an employee, especially in a small private practice, they tend to bundle your jobs or your duties, your descriptions. Probably not even your descriptions, because they will just give you a description as a medical biller, but then have you doing the bookkeeping, the billing, and the coding, right? But your title is medical billing specialist. So you have to understand what your duties are as a biller. And then you have to see if those duties are being compensated and if you are doing stuff outside of the scope of a biller. Sometimes you get a job, you just are happy to get the job, and so you don't question certain things. And also sometimes the people who are hiring you don't really know what the duties of these jobs are. They just figure, well, my old biller was doing bookkeeping and coding and credentialing and this and this and that, so this biller should do the same thing. There have been plenty of providers that I had to explain this to. Even my employer, the second employer that I had who I was doing billing for, they just knew that medical billing and coding was together. And so when they hired me, in my job description, it had coding. And I went back to them and I said, look, this is what my duties are as a biller is. I don't do coding. Oh, that's not something I'm gonna do, blah, blah, blah. And we discussed it. You don't have to take what people give you. You also have to be sure enough in yourself and your duties and know what your job should be. So when it comes to duties, they can be very helpful, which they were in my experience, because now I am capable to be an office manager, to be a bookkeeper, and it has helped improve me in general in so many ways. But let's say you don't want to do that. You just want to be a biller. You need to look into the duties that they are requiring you to do. I would always say the more knowledge you learn, the more you can pick up and you can take somewhere else if you need to, the better. But you need to determine if that's what you want to do. And fourth, the provider's revenue, I think I've said this throughout the video, really, really matters. So as a provider, if I am bringing in $10,000 each month, which for a private practice, for, a provider, that's not a whole lot of money. I am not going to be willing to pay a biller, whether that is an employee, whether that is a business owner. I am not going to be willing to pay them half of what I'm bringing in, because now I still need to sustain my practice. I still need to probably pay others. I need to pay myself. I need to pay my expenses. I need to do all of these things. So I can't give a biller half of my money. So you need to also think about how much the provider is bringing in, how much they can bring in. All of that matters when it comes to what they are capable of paying you. So I've shared with you how much I have made as a medical biller in different capacities of medical billing. And I'd love to hear which one you think is more intriguing for you to do. So make sure you leave that in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you again in my next video.